and I'd also like to thank the audiences, many of you are here, have been so attentive and so, well, what can I say, attentive, supportive, engaged with the work that's been presented, and it's been great. And I really also want to thank our volunteers. I know there were things last night, and probably none of them are here. They're probably too wiped out to show up.
We sucked them dry.
We sucked them dry. And I also wanted, in addition to the artists who presented work live, I also wanted to acknowledge the artists who allowed their work to be compiled in the D2D documentation screening, because I think that was a really wonderful thing, and I'm going to be going back to them and asking them if they would be able to have their work stay in that compilation and be distributed in some way. And of course, maybe in the process of this, or this is something that Clive has talked about a lot, is the idea of making compilations so that we do get the work out there. So we may 7A11D may be coming back to the artists as well and saying, what do you think? Can we do this? Can we get the work out there on videotape? On the other hand, there's nothing beats live, and there's been some really great live stuff. Okay, all these panelists lined up here now, so I guess I'm going to have to put them to work. We are like Benjamin's angel being blown backward. That's a reference to Walter Benjamin, and it's kind of become Bruce and I were talking about this, it's kind of become a pop image now. It's interesting how high-flown philosophical and theoretical discussion works its way into pop imagery, and it's certainly something that, a territory that performance art knows well. But my main point for seizing on this image was that I felt that we were looking back at a kind of debris piling up from 5 decades of performance art, and as much as we struggle against the idea of lineage, we waver between the peddling of an iconoclastic one-upmanship, feminist autonomy, and the autodidact enfant sauvage. The reoccurring avant-gardism of ever-stretching boundaries and ever-demolishing forms against a hardly credible faith in the artist's ability to transgress for the sake of edification. Transgression as pedagogy. We feminists reject the paternity of a conchi, and yet are herded into a patrilineage via slide collections and whispered histories. I'm seeing a return to the reproduction of states of oppression and victimhood by many performers, not only women. Is there a strategy, a theory connected to these images? Is there a notion of solidarity with the actual oppressed, or with the psychic twin? Artists, curators, critics, pedagogues, how do we could just say teachers? How do we differently manipulate the history of what we do? And what is at stake? Who does performance art history belong to? Did Paul McCarthy beget the Osbornes? Bruce says no, it was the Loud family. Are images of political action, is history fatal? So those were some of the questions that I threw out to some of the panelists. And then I'd kind of like to tell you who's sitting here. Tagny Duff is born and raised in Vancouver, and recently moved to Montreal, where she's doing her MFA at Concordia. And she has done a lot of, and I hope we'll describe some of her work. I've asked Alissa and Tagny to describe their work because they didn't actually. Tagny did perform last night with Reciprocity, but they didn't do solo work in the festival, which both Bruce and Clive did, and which some of you may have seen. But she had, I first became aware of her with this very amazing kind of a mall intervention piece, which she did in, I think, 97, 98, student at the Ontario College of Art and Design, and she was in my performance class last year, and has been producing a lot of work on you. You can just look flinch, so I don't know what it is. She's been producing consistently interesting work both inside and outside, way outside of that class, over the last couple of years. Clive, I don't know, probably needs no introduction. At least to his students. What?
But you better do it anyway.
But I better do it anyway. Clive Robertson is, oh, what can I say? I've had to introduce you so many times, Clive. One of the ways I had thought of organizing this panel was to have someone introduce, someone from each kind of generation of performance, someone representing the 20-year-olds and 30-year-olds. I'm going to represent the 40-year-olds and 50-year-olds and the 55-year-olds.
And the old farts.
The old farts at the end. So that's how it's roughly organized. Clive, do you want to say anything? I can't introduce. And Bruce Barber teaches at NASCAD in Halifax and has some interesting sentences in literal art on the web right now, which I think that's in the brochure. And has just completed 30 hours of community service, so he's a little tired. Clive, I'm just going to let you start, because in fact this panel started with a conversation that Clive and I had.
Okay, thanks, Julie. So what I wanted to do was just to, because these conversations, because of the complex nature of the audience who is here, who are the artists, what the history of their practices are, where they live, where they're going. Some of you, quite a few of you, have been at these things before, both the 7 day 11 days organized, and mostly, or because they've been so consistent, the similar discussions in Quebec City, but of course in Vancouver and Calgary, Ottawa, and so on and so forth. And I wanted to be sort of quite specific about what I wanted to offer, whether it's of use or not, because I think there's a certain point in these discussions where, well, okay, what is this panel for? Is it to talk about the work we've just seen in the festival? Is it when we start talking about, you know, written histories or teaching performance or reciprocity? I mean, I think one of the things that we acknowledge, it's happened in the visual arts through alternative spaces, but particularly in performance and video, this idea of reciprocity is really important. I mean, the fact that different people in different locations at different times are willing to do the work that we've just seen to actually get this festival together, and how not just 7A, 11D and Fado, but other independent groups in Toronto have managed to recreate a space for performance here, which I don't think it disappeared in the 80s, but it was quite different. So when we had these discussions with invited guests from other countries who we share in some ways this history that was alluded to in terms of performance history that's been written either locally here or has been written elsewhere, and where that is going. I mean, where the sort of criticism or the writing about performance is going, which is something that interests me, and I'm not going to talk about it too much, except to recognize the fact that now, aside from this sort of development within performance theory of writers like Amelia Jones, we also have individual artists now who are writing books to explain the different processes, the different methodologies and historical approaches where they use their own work as an example. And my interest in this, I guess, is because finally, after, well, not finally, but quite recently, I'm now actually teaching performance. And so it relates to the work that I presented here, Turning the Page, because there were a lot of things in that performance aside from destroying the guitar. Robin Page's, the recreation of Robin Page's piece from 1965. And Robin Page, as I found out during the festival, and I should have really announced at the end, except it would have been a bit weird, is he's actually living in Nova Scotia, and he's got some sort of degenerative eye disease, and he's making ceramics, and he's pissed off that nobody in Canada has ever heard of him. So without wanting to find originators of performance art, he was he was somebody who was working in the mid-60s, who was Canadian in Europe. And what I'm interested about is that there's a number of works he may or may not have done that we've never heard about. So not only at the other end, whether you're in your 20s or whether you're in your mid-50s, generally we share something that we know that within our own locale, people actually don't know what we do. I mean, they don't know a lot of work. We keep publishing a few things here and there. But in relationship to other artists, we don't really know what each other's done, which is why it's important for publications like the one that came out, the one that we just launched today on Margaret. Okay, so I've set that up without, I yet have a question. The question I'm sort of posing, that I pose for myself, is how do we learn from the histories of performance art, or how do we acknowledge that, or how do we not know that we're including work? And also, how then do we attempt to stimulate some knowledge about that from all these disparate, partial writings of history that are both part of what I think of as artists being public intellectuals doing research, and academic research, which is really, they can coexist together, but they're completely different things. People are rewarded differently in different ways. But how then do we, what is it that we're passing on when, in fact, we try and get other people to make work? Where does it start? Where does it, so my approach with this fourth year class that I'm doing right now is to try, is to figure out what the methodologies have been for different types of performance. And because it's like a real fast thing that happens, in 12 weeks, students are asked to make 3 different works from different eras, and then finally they actually do what we've just done, which is to perform publicly. So I try and get people to sort of understand what is behind creating a sort of event, a sort of Yoko Ono, Fluxus, George Brecht event. What is behind, or what the strategies are for creating happenings. And happenings are actually strange. It's the weird, it's the most, it looks like the most pictorially obvious thing that you could do, but it's very difficult to, not to recreate historic works, but to use the methodology, because often they look like events and they look like performance. What's the difference between a happening and performing? I don't really care. What I'm interested in is getting people to use their own lives, their own critical view of the culture around them in their own generation, and to sort of produce work. Performance becomes something else. What is performance art? I mean, how many, what, for those of us that are practicing, we don't ask ourselves those questions, but other people do. I think that the audience has the power that I want them to have in performance. In other words, all of the performances that we do and we perform in festivals, I think only parts of them work ever, from the audience's perspective. And the audience includes us, whether we've just made our first performance, or we've been around a long time, or it's not, okay, what works? It's not a theatrical set of rules, but we know what works at any one point in time. It could be how long the event is or whatever. So those are some of the things that I think it's important to take into consideration. My hope, therefore, is that not that I'm imposing any history, or not any history, but I mean that I'm not over-imposing history, and that by trying to find out what specific types of, not types of performance, but what specific premises and concepts for performance can actually be handed over, and then people can make work. And there is some amazing work that I'm not talking about my own students particularly, but I would include them. There's some amazing work that, and I'll just give you one example and then I'll stop. Okay. Not myself, but somebody else was teaching at Queen's this fall who was brought in as an underpaid sessional, and just gave this exercise of how to ask the students to create one object or one action. And it was in the second year of an undergraduate program. And this woman from Sri Lanka produced this object, which she made a box, and on stencil on the side of it, she made a wooden box, slatted box, and the stencil on the side of it was made in Afghanistan, not for profit. Inside, she made these multiples that were fabric that had the Afghanistani flag on it, and inside were herbs and some lentils and a sheet on how to make a meal. And she made this because she was so pissed off at how the Afghanistani people had been belittled by the Americans sending peanut butter and jam, dropping peanut butter and jam out of the sky as the aid package. So she made this work. She was dressed, quite formally, and she went out onto the streets of Kingston and to hand out these packages, getting people to take food aid. So the whole idea was to produce food aid for North America, including Canada. And she had, because they had to document it, she had a video camera with it. So she just did it on the main street of a small town, and we watched the video, and the people wanted to take the food aid package, but they didn't want to be videotaped. There was this big suspicion about surveillance, that somehow the footage, and they came up to her and they said, well, what do you, she said, would you like to take on these packages? And she said, this is a performance art piece. It's about, she said it in like 3 sentences. But those of us that were there were just blown away by this. How could you, you're asked to do something real simple, to create an object, create an action, and something like that came out of it. And of course, it provided lots of discussion about how successful it was or whatever else. But so if we could create that achievement, pedagogically for ourselves or for younger people like that, we would have no, we would have, I wouldn't say we would have no problems, but this discussion might be quite good. So
Well, I think it would be actually appropriate to ask Alissa to talk now, because I posed the question to her about how she entered performance, really. And so that seems like a
Great answer.
follow.
I was thinking about it a lot actually as you were talking. I'm finishing up at OCAD, and I was in a second year critical perspectives or contemporary issues class with Johanna. And I think the assignment was to do something with memory, and we could do it at any medium or whatever we chose. And I just wanted to do performance because I hadn't done it before, and I just really felt like I had to. It was like almost like a compulsion for me. I didn't really, I don't know. I just feel like I need to get it out of my system. It's a much more intuitive thing for me because I love to write and I love to read and I love to think about, apply theory to some of the other stuff that I do in video and just kind of started doing a little bit of curatorial practice. But for me, performance really comes from a much more passionate, a much more intuitive kind of place, and that I guess I just felt propelled towards it somehow. Does that answer the question?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Keep going. Okay, so I guess hesitate to use the word feminist or post-feminist, but I guess those phrases can frame what I do. I've done a couple of pieces where I'll redo a performance that someone else has done in the past, like Valley Export or Yoko Ono, but apply a totally different set of aesthetics to it, which kind of shifts it to, it almost looks like it's post-feminist, or it looks like it's anti-feminist in a way. And that I'm trying to answer some questions about how I actually look at feminism from my perspective as a young woman today. I find feminism to be a really, really important part of contemporary culture, but I don't necessarily identify with a lot of some of the I'm not really answering that, sorry. Some of the subjectifiers and the symbols I kind of find problematic, and I guess I'm working towards a new way of defining it in a contemporary way, or a way that I can identify with. And then the second part of some of the performances that I've done are, just simply put, I guess I've done a series of death performances where I stage a death scene or an aftermath, and I take it to the point that the aesthetic is so heightened that the actual action is almost invisible. Like what's really, the fact that I look like I'm dead, but there's, I usually wear a lot of makeup, or I'm partly naked or something like that, and I'm just trying to address I guess the way that media really glamorizes the whole live fast idea, and there's definitely an eroticization applied to death in the media, which bothers me, and I guess taking that even one step further, so to the full extreme.
So when you do your work, are you working from? I mean, you're familiar with feminist discourse,
Yeah.
and when you talk about post-feminist discourse, you sound ambivalent about that term too.
I think the word post-feminist is really, really problematic because I think it basically means beyond feminism, or anti-feminism, but I really think that that's possible, and feminism is really quite prevalent and very important, but that sometimes it's really powerful to actually mask it behind something else. And I guess that's where I come from with my work, is to sort of play with the aesthetic, dress it up, to the point of it being almost like I'll become a caricature of myself, which.
See, to me, that's post-feminist. I think
Yeah.
that's a post-feminist strategy that I see being used quite a lot. And in fact, when I'm discussing issues of, feminism and trying to say, well, actually, it's time we kind of push the critique more to kind of reflect on itself. And I bring up the term post-feminism. There's a huge kind of reaction against that, because it seems that people are afraid of letting go of that term, because it means letting go of all the work that it took to get the history of feminism, which I don't think is the case.
Yeah.
I think that post-feminism is just really kind of an extension of feminism critiquing itself, just like postmodernism is a critique of modernism, and it's questionable if it's even, it isn't after feminism. It's part also of the same trajectory of history.
Yeah, the name is
That's
definitely
why-
problematic, and that's sort of why I try not to use it, but
We can work on that.
yeah, that's a good one.
But maybe I can also say, because I come from that same experience where I've gone to art school, I studied painting, and I have a very classical background in visual arts. And when I went throughout high school and early into university, and I really had a very difficult time painting because of the whole history of sexism in painting, and then there's this whole the feminist critique of painting made it just almost impossible for me to find a place for myself to paint. So I said, I need something else. I need to leave painting and try something more direct, more politically engaged. more involved with the physical, the tactile, some haptic experience is something that I was really craving. And so I actually ended up taking the first performance art class at Emily Carr Institute of Art and Design. And it opened up a whole new world, and it was still very, very small. Not many people took the course. No one really knew what was going on, what it was. And it was about learning about the Fluxus happenings and going through the whole historical stage. And that was the first time that there was some kind of pedagogy for performance art. But now, having gone through all that and come out of the art school with this, heavy critique and this sort of critical theory background, now it's having to unlearn all that to do work again, to find some kind of direct, more of a methodology of working that isn't just about reproducing the same methodology and the same strategies, because those strategies don't work today. And I think that's something you were saying earlier on about, is transgression as pedagogy, can those same strategies work today? Well, I think we're looking at a different context, and so many of those strategies may not work. So maybe I'd like to open it up for someone else to comment.
Well, and also, you guys up there in the white chairs.
And this is the other thing I don't like this panel, us, them, not having that kind of integrated discussion. To me, this was what I having gone to school and wanted to be an artist, I didn't want to be one of the people sitting up here, lecturing. Yeah, so if anyone else has comments.
Structure is okay. Structure is okay. It's something to work against. It's just another side of a table.
Question. I did pose this question, which was that, and also feel free to get up and get a glass of water.
Thank you.
I felt uncomfortable with some of your work, Alissa, in that it seemed to me, again, this kind of, mining this vein of transgression and iconoclasm that I think has kind of, in a way, played itself out, and yet, that's without the explanation attached, right? That's just the images.
Yeah.
So then there's this, difficulty around work that is, how do you put that work out there, which is so image oriented, and then let its underlying meaning come.
I think it's because I'm a selfish person.
I didn't mean how can. I didn't mean how can you. I mean how. What are the possibilities for that?
No,
What are the strategies for?
Like what
But
happens
I don't know.
between the
Being a selfish person is an interesting idea. I'll elaborate on that.
I think I'm a bit of a brat, and I just really like to do that. I like to kind of. I'm almost doing it for myself. I don't really think I'm necessarily coming from a perspective of trying to prescribe something as much as just piss people off or make them confused. I guess I hope that they would think about it a bit longer afterwards, after this, since there was like Victor Death in the past of blood. That's a really problematic image. It's really, for a lot of different reasons. I would hope that they would go away and think about it for a couple hours that evening maybe, but if that doesn't happen, it's still really pleasurable for me. Maybe that's like a really taboo thing to say, but I do really just enjoy doing it, and I hope that it comes across in other ways for other people, but I think I do it for myself first.
Yeah, well, I think that's interesting, when you say it's pleasurable for me, because obviously, this is still. Is Elizabeth here? Or did she go? We were having this conversation about how those of us who had done a lot of body work, I know Tagny, for instance, started as a dancer
Well, I've
Or
done
you
some
did dance,
movement
and
stuff,
of
yeah.
course Margaret danced her way through most of the last century. And, you know, this is about the body, after all. I mean, we are sitting here talking about bodies, acting bodies, and of course there needs to be some pleasure in that, or there will be some pleasure in that, of course. And some of the other images, though, that come forth are images of self-abnegation and what's that other word?
What? There's many-
Abjection, that other A word, abjection and
Denial,
denial.
refusal, negation.
Yeah, those neoist words.
Don't give them a boot box.
Or a platform, a podium. Did I finish that sentence? No. Could somebody finish it for me?
Okay, well, maybe I'll jump in here because
Yeah.
you know, we're here talking about the history of performance art, and one of the biggest sort of cringe factors for me, and I'll be honest, is being called a performance artist. And you know, one of the things is that because I work with the body, you know, that this is a label that's been put on me, and you know, I'm interested in following the trajectory of performance art history because it's something that I've been learned, and I understand that there needs to be this place to talk about it so that people can understand what is being done in this kind of genre. But at the same time, you know, it now is a genre, and this is a very recent phenomenon. And Judy Radul wrote a really excellent essay calling, where she said that performance art is sort of like a double-jointed anti-genre, because it kind of works like genre, anti-genre, genre, anti-genre, and it kind of goes back and forth, kind of in the circle over and over and over. It's kind of neurotic. And you kind of get caught in that loop. And is there room to kind of work outside of that kind of genre structure? I mean, that's why I left painting. You know, I wanted to kind of find new forms of expression. And it seems to me that performance art really does have you know, does have a formula. There are, you know, subgenres within the genres and certain methodologies. And it's sort of it's kind of fallen upon itself, you know, where at one point it was also about anti-commodification, and that was really a big emphasis, and getting sort of working outside of the star system that the you know, visual art gallery system really creates. And so now as performance art is moving into the gallery, it again is kind of falling into that same history. So, you know, I have a lot of hesitations about these kind of discussions, and I've actually sat in a number trying to define performance art, It's like, well, I'd actually like to talk about other things that are going on besides performance art. But the thing that's critical about it, that's really important, is that there is a place for this kind of work to be done. And in terms of funding, you know, money issues, it comes down to, well, what exactly are you doing? Well, how can we codify what you're doing? You know, and that's what will give you money to do the work, give you the space, the resources. So we're kind of stuck in this kind of problem.
Can I just say before you start going, Bruce? I think I don't disagree with you, but I don't think we should get caught up with what experimentalism period's gone through, whether it's like film or performance art or whatever. I mean, performance art was, I don't see, it doesn't matter what we call it, it went through incredible commodification at the end of the 70s. I mean, I have tape clips of so many TV soap operas, let alone Hollywood movies, in which performance is a big part. Performance art is there. There's a fictitious performance artist doing this, doing that, whatever. You know, it was, and the problem is that, you know, it's interesting what happened here, because this festival received a really attentive, large audience, but various people have said, you know, we don't want it to get too much bigger than this, because we know where that heads to, and I think and that's where, you know, the sort of, it's not to be naive about we don't have you know, the idea of a market is we all market stuff in whatever way, mostly unsuccessfully, but we're engaged in a market of some sort. But I think that it isn't so much about you know, like you said, it's not so much the history. We can't get caught up in reliving this history of experimentalism, you know, and yet at the same time we want some remnants of an avant-garde practice. And I think what a number of people in this room would ascribe to in terms of in whichever way we think of it as being oppositional, yes, it's utopian, so what? You know, it's like we're not about to become, we know where certain types of pragmatism lead us to in the art field. And I don't think but I mean, I'll say I'm not interested in investing in that route. And some of us have been able to say, even though we haven't had any, I mean, I disagree with you that performance art is going to go into the galleries or the museums. And
Well, it is going into the galleries.
well, we could have a whole discussion about how that is, you know.
It's
It
kind of there. I
it
agree
comes
with
back
It's kind
to-
of there, but it's not really there.
Yeah, I mean, there hasn't been any, I mean, let me just say, and apologize to the people who don't live in the country, but in this country that come from elsewhere, but there hasn't been any that type of institutional support for performance art. The history of those collaborations is way over, I mean, like whether it's the Vancouver Art Gallery or, it just hasn't happened. Tanya Mars is one of the few artists who's actually had a museum exhibition as a performance artist. It just hasn't, and I'm not complaining about it. I actually, you know, somebody said the other day, you know, call it Buddhist, call it whatever, you know, it's maybe for some of us who are at a certain age, maybe we should just let it go. It's actually been a benefit that we've actually had to fight to keep creating either alternative or oppositional space. But I just wanted to stop, and this may sound weird, but for those of us that lived through, when you're talking about feminism and post-feminism, I think we hope that the sort of open, not popular culture, but the sort of public culture at large has taken in certain things. But some of the things that a number of us went through in terms of anti-racism or anti-poverty or feminism, censorship, those things didn't get through to the public culture enough so that even though when I talk about these historical forms of performance art that I'm not pushing, one of the big problems in terms of teaching post high school is that people for a long time, I mean younger students for a long time, some of which are, and it's not an ideological thing, they are totally shocked by queer content, by transgender content, whatever else. For the rest of us, we think that these things have moved in the culture, and that but it's not true. It's a total, it's a fiction. So, I think, anyway.
Yes.
Actually, before I begin, I guess this is a stage you went for me.
Well,
But perhaps there may be some comments from members.
I wanted to, actually, I don't know if I want, I don't want to put you on the spot, Roy, if you don't want to be on it, but we had a conversation, the night that Roy Varwa arrived here from Finland, and maybe it was with the long flight and all of that, but he was sounding extremely negative about the efficacy of performance and whether in fact it could, that it was just this small practice compared to, any Spider-Man movie or, that in terms of its reach, its scope, how it affects the culture. And so we talked about that a little bit, and I don't know if you've thought about that conversation or your own position within that.
Well, generally I feel that, or I see that, the community of performance artists is small everywhere, but still it has existed since, after the
Second World War, since the 50s and 60s, and people have worked their whole life and been, I suppose, very serious, at least those who continued such a long time. But how it has changed generally, the system, I only see that, okay, the advertisement takes the forms of performance art or whatever, so the system actually can consume and not take the most important thing, the thing what we are working for. And this is sort of disappointing or kind of feeling what I have.
And then I countered that by saying that I felt that this is something that I pick up these little phrases from people like Chris Deva and Benjamin, and don't ever read the whole book, right? I just look at the pictures, but anyway, I was at a lecture once, and Chris Deva was talking about theater as being a guarantor of psychic space. And so, in a way, I feel that that's my position now around performance, and why I say, in a way, to me, it doesn't matter if we're getting a nice, 100 or 50 people. So many. Oh, 150. Wow. Or 20. It's about a pocket in the collective mind, if you can be such a airhead. But that we, in a sense, we guarantee a kind of psychic space for this work, this kind of thought, this kind of connection of mind and body to occur. And if we weren't doing it, the culture would utterly die. I think we're actually keeping everybody alive by doing this. Like the trees, the process, oxygen, carbon dioxide. So if that doesn't sound a little too messianic, that's my position on that. I think it's incredibly important what has been done. So otherwise,
Yeah, I would say, I don't know if I could say it's keeping the culture alive. I know it's keeping me alive.
yeah.
Very seriously, I would be dead if I hadn't found performance art. I'm quite sure of that. And it's a place where at least we can sustain each other and allow these ideas to continue to exist and to grow. And that's one interesting thing about looking back at history and looking back at what's been done, because as Roy says, advertisement takes these formal aspects of what we do and assimilates them very quickly, and that much of it leads into popular culture completely in a commodification format. But I think one of the reasons it's interesting that artists continue to look at old strategies and reinvent them or rediscover them is that the real meanings in those structures have not been translated into popular culture. So it's when you go back to it, even though people say, oh, that's from the 70s, that's old. The fact is, when I've seen so-called 70s performances being done in this context, we're kind of rediscovering the other aspects of it that didn't bleed into popular culture that are probably the ones that are really important.
I think one of the clearest examples is, instead of blaming the system or popular culture or whatever, Yoko Ono's retrospective, which we all know was like this mega expensive thing for the cut piece, the ladder piece, yes piece. Why was it? I went to that exhibition. There were people who were fans of Yoko or Germ or whatever, or there was some symbolism in their meeting over this piece. There were people lining up to climb a 5-foot ladder to be able to get the experience of reading Yes, and they were not allowed to do it. They were not allowed to do it. The museum had no idea that they could actually, rent 16 ladders, you know. They could have had like safety braces on the people chained to the ceiling so they wouldn't fall off the ladder. I mean, it's like, that is history for me. I mean, that is a versioning of history where
You're not allowed to touch
you
it.
have people asked to do something really simple. They really want, I mean, people were really pissed off. They couldn't do it. They were telling the docents and everything. You know, it's like people want to do this and you stop them from doing it. And it's like, if we could have, I mean, we should have done it in the community. We could have, you know, either got press or whatever and just had ladders all over the cities and people's apartments with them. You know, you could have said, here's the real Yoko Ono experience, you know, don't
Well,
be
we
fooled.
did. Alissa actually did.
Anyway, I'm over
And
it.
let
I'm
me
over
just
it.
kind of
Yeah.
describe this to you, Clive.
Yeah.
We did here in this space, put a ladder and Alissa put herself up there in the rafters to say yes. Climb the ladder. So, you know, it didn't work. So, one version got done. I mean, one ladder got put up. But
I think that that's one of the most powerful things about performance art is that it can really incite this type of discussion, like that it, you know, it encourages a fruitful exchange back and forth and talk about these kinds of issues. It really lends itself to frustration and arguments and people getting, you know, their blood rushing. I think that's, and I guess maybe I said it, when I was talking about my work earlier, I kind of might have been a bit inflammatory by saying, you know, I do it for myself, but, and that, like, that almost sounds like I don't care what, you know, what people take away from it, but that's the most important thing, is what people get from it in the discussions I get into it.
Okay, so Bruce is wiggling this slide projector.
Well, I'm not, this is not an intervention. And, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Johanna for including me in the panel. And if there's anything that people want to say before I begin my 10-minute, are we allowed 10 minutes or more?
Ewan, you want to say something?
There's only 3 slides. Okay.
There's 3 slides.
Does anyone want to say anything in response to it?
Ewan.
Actually, a lot of things I followed the discussions today. Maybe just one point. Actually, a lot. I want to discuss some more with this stuff. I think performance is a way, a personal way that some artists to avoid a lot of things in the limited medium or in the or modern or traditional or so on, you know, because they have to follow that route, the technical methods, standards, and certain philosophy and so on. And the performance that's a medium, unlimited mediums that can be personal, can fight against anything, can do anywhere. So that's just a way, personal, to make any idea to society and anywhere. That's kind of a way, personal way to avoid certain limited medium in the world. So there's a lot of possibility in one medium. Personal presentation, not representation.
Not about representation.
Presentation.
Presentation.
Carol,
I missed a few minutes of Clive's speech, but I think one of the things that has to be also stressed around performance art is that because there is no product to sell at the end, that the push when you talk about things becoming more and more commercialized, because the push, of course, is that we are not getting more artist-run centres, and there are not larger amounts of money going to the artist-run centres, that unless either places like Harbourfront or the Art Gallery is able to bring in a performance artist, the places for an artist to actually still earn an income at being an artist, in other words, as a professional person, is becoming slimmer. Of course, we've gotten many more spaces that are open at collectives and so forth all the way down Queen Street, but that still is not possible. I mean, in other words, then it becomes your own economics to put out, but you don't have a product to sell at the end of it. So it's very difficult for someone to take and be part of a collective in an artist-owned, cooperative. So if we begin to not again continue to fight for money to go to artist-run spaces which allow for performance art to be part of programming, and demand that those artist-run spaces, of course, put that into their programming, whether they be TPW or what. In other words, seeing spaces that are run, even though they're photography galleries, but if they are run in such a way to open up those spaces in order to put on performance arts. Because it's not dissimilar to what's happening in universities at this point, where in the sciences, money is continuously going by large corporations for funding for this or funding for that. But to actually stop and think and produce and create a new way of viewing the world, there's very little money is actually going into universities that are not earmarked in the sciences to be specifically earmarked to a product. So we've moved into such a consumerized world that all the areas, from sciences to the arts, if they don't have a product to sell at the end, it's not legitimate. I mean, that's the ideology we're in this moment in time. So if we don't go back again and continue to fight for tax money, which those fuckers are using with their tax dollars to pay off these corporate the AGO to put a friggin' car in there, that's a tax write-off. That's tax money. So again, going back to this struggle years ago of fighting for artist-run spaces allows for performance art to actually have a legitimate place to be able to create the strength that it has over the years.
Well, I think maybe one thing that I'm experiencing is that, well, a lot of artist-run centers have programming for performance art. They're not really well equipped to deal with that form of art making, and it's been a constant frustration for me to have to do work in artist-run centers. And so now I'm seeing a bunch of festivals pop up all across Canada, and of course there's the whole international circuit. And that's it's actually a different way of working when you're in festivals, which tends to be more open to different ways of working in performance art, because there's so many different types of performance art. But yet there's less money in the festivals.
I was just going to say, but there's usually in an artist space they're required to pay you an artist fee, and they're not necessarily keeping up with Carl rates.
Yeah, so I mean, both those models aren't really working.
Not ideal.
So,
I've been teaching performance since 1989 and doing performance since 1974. And what I think performance does is, despite the fact that it's a very alienating, often alienating kind of practice, still alienating. You're doing alienating work, deliberately doing it. We were doing it in 1974, they were doing it in 1957. But despite that, what I see and from my students is that, unlike any other art class, the students who take performance art, whether they go on to do performance, bond in a way that no other students in the art school bond. The painting classes do not bond. You know, the video classes kind of bond, but not in the way that the performance art class bonds. And I think that we as performance artists are a kind of glue for our community. We animate our community, we make mythology that lives on, things get misrepresented, and we don't care, it just kind of goes on. And so for me, I think that performance art is a kind of glue, a community glue. And it doesn't matter if it's big or a lot.
May I say something?
I think Andre was before.
Well, I just wanted to find it interesting to discuss and say, well, how much influence has anything or something little as an action or this festival or anything. But I think I wouldn't worry too much about it. I think maybe the effects are often bigger than one thinks. And like one picture in my head is just from a different area, which is homeopathy. Or you say that? So there's like you take almost all the substance out of it. You take all out, but then the power is the biggest. So it's not always about like, okay, there's so many people out and they're all doing this and this, but there's only 1 or 12 or 15 doing something else, and that's so little. So I think, yeah, I think there is a lot of energy and power going on in anything, it can be. So I think I wouldn't worry about numbers or quantities.
Oh,
And
I
of course
love
it's all-
that. I just love that. We are in the 1,000.
Yeah.
Moratorium on bean counters.
Skip, you were gonna say something?
Yeah, well, Andre actually said half about what I was going to talk about. I don't get really, though, thank you very much. I don't have to talk as much now. I've never really gotten too concerned about the quote-unquote community, as far as like performance community. I've been much more interested in making art, and it just happens to be that my body is used a lot in what I do. And I've never found a problem. Yes, there's been a lot of bitching about it, you know, with people, but I've never found a problem walking into a gallery if I have an interest in them, saying, hey, you know, what can we do? And what kind of project can we do together? Instead of using the word performance or action, it's like, let's do a project. No, it's not sellable, but I still get paid, and you sell paintings, and thank God for painters, because I wouldn't have a job. And also within that, there is the institution, and then within that, there is the festival, and within that, there's the Kunsthal. And so I really tried really hard to find myself, put myself in avenues or areas that offer all these different things, so because when I add it all together, I make a living. And I get to do what I want to do. I get to turn people on, I get to travel, and I get to pay my rent. And in my era growing up, I'm 45, there was many things that were ending like Vietnam and stuff, but there was a lot of self-centeredness. And I guess in my sense, I am a self-centered person in that I have to be concerned in how I stay alive. So I've decided, even though, yes, I use my body and this is what I do, I try to find all the different avenues that are out there. Like I applied for a grant for sculpture. I decided my body's sculpture, why not? Get $5,000. If you don't do it, that $5,000 is going to go to somebody else. Or, you know, if I don't take that opportunity with the Ace Gallery and they pay me and they sell paintings, then I lose out on something. But I like that if one can use all the avenues, then I guess I just don't have to think about a community, quote unquote. I just think about it as a total thing. I'm an artist, and that's all I know.
Okay. I rather liked Johanna's Deleuzian approach to the statement here, where she mixes metaphors, folds trains of thought into other trains. And I was struck by the several key words and key phrases. And the first, Benjamin's angel being blown backward, looking at the debris piling up from 5 decades of performance art, I suspect is probably from Walter Benjamin's thesis on the philosophy of history. And there was another one that I remember very well because I've used it in a couple of essays. And I think it's appropriate possibly for the discussion with respect to images versus iconoclasms. So I want to make a few points with regard to this, but I'm going to tell you, I'm just going to paraphrase this thesis on the philosophy of history. Benjamin wrote, it's not necessary to represent history as it really was, but to seize hold of an image in the moment of danger. Now, I've thought about this thesis a lot because being somewhat of a postmodernist, I believe that there is no single lineage, there is no there are no major progenitors of history. History is a process. In fact, there are several histories, some of which compete with each other. And it seems to me that the idea of a lineage, which is somewhat of a sacred cow, because we're all trying to constitute history and to insert ourselves into history, if we are not to repudiate what Ralph Dunnigan wrote in 1967 which was to say simply in typical situationist language, all the artists of psychodramas, happenings are doing is renewing the stereotypes. Are we still doing that today? I think in some cases we are. However, it's important, I think, to recognize history as a process and that indeed there are histories. And if we acknowledge that fact, then we don't reify history or run the risk of ossifying our own relationship to histories. That's important because if we go to some of the other sentences in Johanna's Deleuzian tract, where she says, our images of political action, question, is history fatal? Question. Well, I believe it is. All of these things. And I'll try and attempt to show you why. In the short time that I have available to me.
What's on your left case, please?
And of course, we now recognize this to be an elaborate form of plumbing that doesn't have any real sense of structure to it. That in fact, as soon as you begin to investigate and unpack the isms and the names and so on, that you end up with some problems because some vectors of histories are being dropped out, and there is a kind of implicit structural model being advanced. But around a couple of years ago, I deconstructed this and a surprising thing came to my mind, that this was somewhat rhizome-like. And in fact, it had a very organic, rather than a sense that there were vectors leading to a single line or lineage with progenitors at one end and a single vector all moving towards this avant-garde utopia. And I thought, well, what if we, in fact, did some new work on this? And took it from 1930, from the whole of the 20th century, and mapped the red threads, to mix another metaphor, and fold in aspects of the historical avant-gardes, to use Peter Berger's famous notion, in order to secure some privileged points for where we are to go now, what we are to do now. And it seems to me that there's some very key moments within the last 20th century and some names. This is a very privileged map, or remapping, deconstruction of Alfred Barr, and a remapping according to my own predilections and my own provenance, if you will, as an artist, as a critical practitioner, and as a historian, dare I call myself that, of performance and contemporary art. And it seems that you'll notice performance appears in a couple of cases, but we acknowledge now what was forgotten for 30 years, the importance of the situationists with respect to where we may be going now in terms of our donated practices and our operative practices, our eco-art practice, our liberalist art practices. And you'll notice new media occurs in various key places as well. You'll notice that there are some key figures. Others could be added. These are my own rather quickly inserted figures. We also recognize that some of these terms can take have a larger dominant relationship to where we are now perhaps postmodernism, perhaps postcolonialism, feminism, cultural studies as a greater privileged space in our consciousness than indeed earth art does now, or arte povera. And that the Gulbenkian report, which was so important in Britain, has now led to several vectors and associated histories of community arts in England. And we can look back, and Clive has done research and is writing a book on this, a dissertation project, on this, on similar practices associated with the artist-run centres in Canada. And Canada, as you recognise, has been a worldwide leader in appropriating government funds, tax dollars, to the production of various forms of art practice that we associate with the historical avant-gardes. Neo-avant-garde though it may be. Are we reaching an impasse? I think in the sense we have, but there are some ways out of this impasse, which I think, to your credit, 7A, how do I say that, asterisk?
It's a silent asterisk.
It's a silent asterisk. So I did an intervention by actually putting a sound on it. So this is one map documenting features of the red threads in historical practices, histories that I've played with over the last few years.
Practices in the corner here?
What's that?
Donated practices?
Donated practices, yes.
What does that mean?
I think that's practices giving. Most artists take. And the 80s was a great time for the appropriation and expropriation of images from, and of course this taking and this traffic, as Ellen Seclude will speak about it.
Gift art.
Yeah. But the notion of the gift is a very powerful motif. It's a kind of zeitgeist motif today, I think. But I may be wrong. I think, although there isn't...
Does that mean, what's an example of that? Is that like Geneva feeding people?
I have one.
That's part of the...
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I think many aspects of the performances that have taken place over the last week have donative characteristics in them. And I think if you read through the history of the seven where you take away a piece. And I've been partially responsible for promoting this notion of a donative practice, even though I still don't quite know how it exists within the teleologies of the 20th century practice, thinking of that as a kind of arbitrary thought of time, or indeed the projections that we are now.
And just out of curiosity, why would eco art come more out of community arts and out of earth? Why is that over there?
I think it does. What is so marvelous, you know, Bar's map has a kind of truth value to it. And it was ripped out of the history books for 20 odd years. And yet Deleuze, and his notion of the rhizome allows us to reappropriate Bar's mapping strategies in order to secure an understanding. Except Bar's map should really have arrows going back and forth instead of this teleological movement towards something. They should go both ways. But histories are compounded, constituted through people's agency. And to go back to this, what is at stake here? Who does performance art history belong to? Well, it belongs to everyone. Not only the people who produce this, performances, but it belongs to art historians, generally, and historians have been deconstructing their own practice for the last 30 or 40 years, as have art historians. It belongs to the cultural studies theorists and writers. It belongs to feminist historians, post-colonialist historians, Indonesian historians, to Canadian. And we can also take part in the construction of that history by securing an archive for our own work. And I was talking to Johanna earlier, and I'm going to shut up in a few minutes, to say how important it is, because most of our history, our personal history, is going to be written after we're dead. And that's the truth. As someone who was trained as a conventional art historian many years ago, I recognize that the situationists who repudiated the notion of inserting themselves into history have become historicized, and their work has become commoditized, moreover, and it's been, to recognize the importance of the situationists now is to recognize the lesser importance of fluxus and of pop art and of the happenings, and to renegotiate that historical epoch which led to the critical operative practices that we associate with the post-war French avant-gardes and also subsequently the international avant-gardes. And for me this is fascinating. And it seems to me that 7A, 11D, in this kind of local community with a global sense of its mission and its identities, conflating both local and global into global, provides us with a kind of microcosmic model for, in fact, how histories around performance arts or performances can be constituted and reconstituted. While I would be the first to acknowledge that Robin Page, to give Clive an opportunity to argue, is important, I would also suggest that we don't single out individuals like that necessarily to begin our genealogies. That in fact, as Marx and Freud and other major thinkers of the 19th century suggested, we are all dwarfs on giant shoulders. And I think that that's something we should recognize. Did Paul McCarthy beget the Osborns? No. An American family did. The Loud family begetted, if we can even think of that, a whole host of survivor programs, reality-based TV, certain genres of performance art, and you name it, the Loud family was an event of some significance, culturally speaking, in the North American context. But as soon as we go out of that, as our colleagues from other parts of the world, and as I myself understand and have embedded in my consciousness and in my body, I am part of the post-colonialist mafia, because my education occurred in New Zealand. I started did performance art first in 1969. How many of you know that work? None of you do, but the people in New Zealand and Australia know that work. And in some ways, some of that work is work that I'd like to forget. And I've been guilty of many things in my life. The most guilty thing I've said as far as constituting and reconstituting, interpreting, constructing history is concerned, I wrote in 1980, performance art is dead. But I was wise enough to add the disclaimer, long live performance. Because I think performance will go on, and as Tagny knows, it's a great icebreaker, and it's a great way as long as, and often when you say performance class, you think, oh, the students at some point are going to take off their clothes. I remember taking my kids to a performance class event, And sure enough, and my kids were cured of doing any performance art for the next 20 years of their life. You mean we have to take off our clothes to do this?
You mean your students or your children?
My children watching my students take off their clothes, and I didn't even know they were taking off their clothes. And was I shocked? No, nothing shocks me anymore about performance art. So thank you.
Well, I think we can just loosen up and mingle then.
Cool.
And talk. And I thank my panelists for their participation. Yeah.
I think we should give a round of applause to you.
Yeah. And I also want to, share this day with Margaret. And there's lots of food and drinks still back there. And I also want to, since I just got a little round of applause there, thank Paul and Tanya and Shannon and Louise.
An art system.
I would first like to thank Paul and Tanya and Louise. And I would not like to include our system yet in this. Thank you. So I just want to thank. And Dave, I'm sorry, and Dave. And Dave who's got the flute. Who's, and Dave Dement. And then we'll early.